Welcome to IBM's Service Training Series, Product Update Volume 5. I'm John Nettuno. This video contains two segments and will provide those of you servicing our ThinkPads an inside look at two recently announced products, the ThinkPad 701 and the ThinkPad 760. In our first segment, we will take a look at the ThinkPad 701, IBM's first sub-notebook featuring our full notebook keyboard and display. Some of the topics we will cover include product overview, maintenance package, assembly and disassembly tips. Our second segment will contain an overview of the ThinkPad 760 family of high-end, full-function notebook computers. Ken Dunn from our mobile development team is now standing by in our service area. So let's look in on Ken and the latest sub-notebook addition to the ThinkPad line.
Today I'd like to take you through the IBM ThinkPad 2630. It comes in two models, the 701c and the 701cs. First I'd like to explain some of the features, then go through the diagnostics and configuration screens, talk a little bit about the function keys, and finally we'll do a teardown and rebuild. Now the only physical difference between the 701c and the CS is that the 701c has a TFT screen, the 701CS has a dual scan STN LCD. Both models can be configured with either a 486 DX2 50 MHz or a DX4 75 MHz processor. Both have internal math coprocessors. The DX2 comes standard with 4 MB of RAM and an 8K internal cache. The DX4 has 8 MB of RAM and a 16K cache. Both RAMs are expandable with either a 4, an 8, or a 16 MB, 70 nanosecond, 3.5 volt, single outline DIMM. Both models feature an audio system with internal microphone and speaker. It also has jacks for an external microphone, an audio in, and headphone speaker jacks. The audio system supports the Sound Blaster and Sound Blaster Pro applications. They both also support local and ISA bus architecture. I'll explain the rest of the features as we point them out. First, let's start on the side. We have one of two AC input jacks, the on-off switch. This is the cover for either the 3.5-inch floppy drive, or it can double as a parallel printer port. It has an internal modem, an internal data fax voice modem at 14.4K with complete telephony support. Here are the jacks for the microphone, audio in, and headphones. On the other side, we have the PC MCIA cover, a removable 360, 540, or optional 720 megabyte hard file, and this is the battery location. On the back, this is the IR window. The infrared transceiver is IRDA compatible and operates at 115.2K. This is the connector for either the multi-port 2 attachment, or with an adapter card it can be connected to the Dock2 expansion unit. Okay, the multi-port 2 attachment comes standard with the unit. It has on the back a serial port, parallel printer port, audio in and out jacks, an external mouse and keyboard ports, a second AC adapter source, and an external monitor. The attachment hooks onto the back of the system, sliding one end into the notch and gently but firmly locking into place, making sure the release lever locks into position. To remove it, it's the exact opposite. For the bottom, we have the battery release latch and the SO DIMM door, and inside the DIMM door is also the pads to remove the customer's password should it be necessary. And we also have the speaker opening. All right, and now for the good stuff. Let's go ahead and open this up. It has a full-size 11.5-inch expanding keyboard with quiet touch keys. It has the Track 3 pointing device embedded. The video screen is both the 701C and the CS are both 10.4-inch color 640 by 480 screens. The 701C is a TFT screen. The 701CS is a dual scan STN screen. Okay, an easy way to tell, besides from the insignia, is the top screw on an STN screen is positioned down about 1/2 inch. The contrast and brightness are controlled through the keyboard function keys. Also on the front we have internal mic location, the LEDs, and this is the keyboard pivot cam. Okay, we'd like to take just a minute here and show you some of the graphics capabilities. This is a TFT screen, and these are live pictures coming straight out of the Microsoft Windows screensaver program. It'll just give you some idea of the quality of the picture of this screen. Okay, from this point we'll want to go into the diagnostics and configuration screens. To start with diagnostics, we'll need to power down. Diagnostics accessories, these are all standard diagnostic tools. This is an audio wrap plug, the serial cable wrap plug, parallel, and PCMCIA cards. You can use any, all, or none of these depending on the diagnostics you're running. In order to initiate the diagnostic screen, we power up the system, and during the post memory count, press F1. Okay, now we're into the easy setup screen. This screen is more or less standard across the ThinkPad line. The first box we can enter directly into the configuration screen. I'll talk more about the configuration screen later. What we want now is to get into the test screen. We can test any single section or all together. To initiate advanced diagnostics, it's a Control A, brings you up a tool icon that you enter into, and it asks you what of the external devices coming through the multiport you'd care to test. It'll prompt you for a diskette drive with a formatted diskette. It'll prompt you to insert the PCMCIA cards and the parallel and serial connectors. From this point, you can either go back to Test All, which will loop through everything that is attached, or you can go down to a single system to test. For example, the PCMCIA, it will test PCMCIA without cards in place. It tests the internal functions. If everything's all right, you'll get a blue OK insignia underneath the particular system. And once you've finished running diagnostics, you can come out to the restart. It'll prompt you, and you can start it back up. Okay, now I'd like to talk a little bit about the alternate function key. It's located at the bottom left-hand corner of the keyboard, marked FN. This key works in conjunction with the top two rows of keys on the keyboard. By pressing the FN key by itself, brings the unit out of suspend mode. The function and F1 brings up the configuration utility screen. We'll talk a little bit more about this later. To escape, function F2 brings up a battery system explaining the approximate percentage of battery life left, approximate hours of battery use left in your power mode that you're in right now, and a battery charging condition icon, smiley face indicating that everything's fine. These toggle off and on. Now to control the video, it's controlled to the function home and end keys to bring the brightness of the LCD up. The function insert and delete keys bring the contrast up and down. These are only operational on the STN model. The brightness is controlled automatically on the TFT screen. And also volume control is controlled by the page up and page down. Okay, now I'd like to talk a little bit about the configuration utility screen. This is the same configuration screen that you can reach through the easy setup screens. To hotkey access, it's function F1. This will bring you into page 1, which concerns power management features, gives you the battery status, lets you configure your battery power modes, also gives you your battery status icon again. Some of the power modes, I have it currently in custom mode. There's a high performance mode, a medium, and a power saver mode. When AC power is plugged in, it automatically defaults to a high performance mode. We don't necessarily want to change anything. And you'll notice when you do change a configuration, you'll get a black arrow telling you that this has been changed. On page 2 are our video settings, control its output, the brightness. Also the time and date are set here. Also down at the bottom is the startup sequence. Currently it's set to Smart, which is the default sequence. It must be set up in Smart or conventional when you're running Diagnostics. So remember that. On page 3, we get into the I/O management. We have another volume control here showing the icon. And on page 4, we have the system information. Tells you what processor you're running, your RAM, your internal cache, and it also points out here your BIOS level. And that's the 4 pages of the configuration screen. Okay, a few notes about flash memory updating. First and most importantly is do not remove power during the update process. This will destroy the BIOS on the flash module and you'll have to replace the bottom system board. It requires a fully charged battery inserted into the bottom. Otherwise, you simply insert the diskette into drive A, power on the computer, and follow the menu. Okay, now we're going to start with the teardown of the unit. We're going to go ahead and do it in sequential order. Now, all of these steps aren't necessary, depending on what you're trying to fix. We're going to go ahead and separate the top from the bottom first, then tear down the bottom, and then the top. Tools required for this are a T6 Torx bit and a T1 Torx bit, and some kind of working stick. Now always remember, all these cards are ESD sensitive, so please wear protection. All right, first things first, we're going to power down the system, which it already is. We're going to remove any of the devices. We're going to remove the AC. I'm going to go ahead and remove the battery, the hard file, and the PCMCIA connector, remembering that these 3 items are all interconnected. Using a quarter quarter, we're not going to get it. Okay, plan B. Okay, to release the battery locking clips at the bottom. And finally, the hard file just gently twists out of place. Okay, we're going to go ahead at this point and remove the memory SIM also. It's not necessary unless you're replacing the bottom board, but it's a good time to go ahead and show it. The SIM connector, the SIM door is on the bottom. It's just a simple twist. Releasing the two latches. And the SIM comes out at about a 30-degree angle. Now at this time I want to show you there are two pads in here for removing the customer's password. Should you receive a unit in that is password protected, you can clear this password by shorting out these two pads. They're located right between the DIMM connector and the edge of the cover. They're two silver pads that are marked R87. I'll show you those better when we get the bottom board out. Okay, using the T6 Torx driver, first we're going to go ahead and remove the keyboard cover. I might make a note at this point that there are 8 different sizes, 8 different lengths of the T6 screw, so a little bit of screw management will be very helpful. I have a tray that I keep them in. I keep them grouped by whatever part I'm removing. First we're going to start with the keyboard cover. There's 2 screws, one right above the Kensington lock slot. The second one is on the bottom, on the left-hand side as it's facing up. Now all these screws are torqued down at about 2.5 inch-pounds, which is not much more than finger tight. Now these other 5 screws are for the keyboard. We're going to go ahead and remove those now. And now we're ready to remove the keyboard. Turn the unit over. Open it up all the way. Now the keyboard cover has 4 locking clips as well, located at about this position. What we're going to want to do is gently lift the right side, and with a gentle rocking back and forth motion, try to release the clips. If it becomes difficult, you can manually close the keyboard, keeping the LCD all the way open. You can turn it on its side and release the locks here and here with your insertion tool. Usually it's more difficult because you have to move the body all around. So anyway, you continue rocking, you can hear the locking clips release and the keyboard cover is removed. From this point, we need to remove the keyboard. We've already taken the 5 screws off the bottom. There is 1 screw in the back underneath the right hinge area. Now right now this is a Torx head screw. Eventually I believe it's going to be changed to a Allen head so we can use a ball driver. You have to reach this at a slight angle, but it's not too difficult as long as you're aware of it. Go ahead and remove this back screw. And now, the 4 front T1 screws. Remove the 4 screws in the front. I remove the center 2 first, and then the outside. Now, these screws are delicate. They're torqued in at 0.5 inch-pounds, which is not much. That's about fingertip tight. Okay, now at this point, the keyboard is loose, but before you remove it, I'm going to show you there are 5 locking clips. Actually, there's 7 locking clips that help hold the keyboard in place. I'm going to manually close it and show you. There are 2 clips located above the diskette drive opening. There are 3 locking clips, one located at each upright and one in the back here. And there's also 2 clips across the front. In order to clear these clips, we need to lay the unit out flat. Grabbing the unit by the front, push backwards slightly to clear the clips, lift it up, and bring it forward about an inch and set it down. At this point, it exposes the 3 ZIF connectors for the 3 keyboard cables. The track point cable is the smallest one, and the other 2 keyboard cables. Remove the track point cable as soon as possible to avoid stress on it. That gives you a little more room and a little more clearance. Go ahead and with equal pressure on each side, open the ZIF connectors and gently remove the flat cables. That removes the keyboard. Okay, now at this point we're going to go ahead and separate the top LCD section from the bottom. Now this step isn't always necessary. It does make for a better working environment, and we're going to go ahead and show the procedure. But if you're at this point and you're just replacing a top card or even the LCD, it's not necessary. But like I say, we're going to go ahead and do it. Okay, the first things you want to do is separate the microphone, and while you're there, let's do the speaker cable also. Remove the microphone cable and the speaker cable. Now the top card is marked speaker and microphone, so it's just keep track of it. Let's remove the LCD flat cable, sliding the ferrite up out of the way, and with equal pressure on both sides, gently work the connector loose. And then pushing up on the ferrite and grabbing at the bottom removes the cable. Go ahead and remove the ferrite to get it out of your way. All right, the last thing is the LCD backlight cable. Need to bring it out from behind. Gently but firmly just remove it from the inverter card. Okay, so we're separated. Let's go ahead and close the top. On the back, we're going to remove the 4 screws holding the hinge to the bases. And now making sure that the front latches are released, remove the top. We'll be tearing that apart later. And now we're down to the base section. Okay, the first thing we're going to do is separate the top system board from the bottom system board. The inverter card is attached to the top system board and comes out as a unit. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to want to do is to, once we're at this point, is to gently lift up on the right side of the system. This allows you a little clearance. At the battery slot, there's a notch to slide in your stick. Now there's a board connector in between here. It's about this long. We want to gently pry the 2 boards apart. We want to separate these 2 aluminum spacers in the back The two spacers are here and here. Sometimes these are stuck in fairly tight. Just try to be careful not to put too much sideward pressure. And now, rotating the top card towards the parallel port, lift up the inverter card and the top card together, removing the IR window, and gently lift out. Okay, let's go ahead and remove the inverter card to prevent any damage. And that is basically the top card removal. You'll notice that one of these spacers attached to the top and the bottom, they'll go either way. Just make sure they're back in place. Okay, from this point, let's go ahead. This is the standby battery. It's taped into place. If you're replacing the top card, let's go ahead and remove the standby battery. Also, on the new top card, if it does not already have these rubber spacers in place, go ahead and you can reuse the old spacers. Just stick them on the new card in the same location. There should be 4 on the bottom, 4 on the top. Okay, now we're down to the bottom board. The bottom board is held in with 3 screws, one right below where the LCD cable is, and the other 2 are back on the multi-port connector. To remove them, there's no particular order in removal. Now with the 3 screws removed, what you want to do is the phone jack on the modem connector is out flush with the base. So you want to bring that in so it'll clear the base. Lift up on the front end. Now this is also slightly adhesive taped in. There's a ground shield on the base that is stuck to the PCMCIA slots. You'll need to clear those. And there's also a little bit of adhesive around the connector port. But otherwise it should just freely slip out. The modem connector is attached to the back. Just gently pry at the connector to remove it. The modem also has an adhesive gasket to help keep it in place during assembly. And here's the bottom board. A few notes on the bottom board. Reuse the PCMCIA slots. They're only held in with 2 nut and bolt type screws. The only other thing that I can think of on the bottom card is this rubber spacer laid in beside the LCD cable. What we found was happening was that the LCD ferrite would sometimes short against these pins, so this prevents that. Otherwise, the bottom card. Right. One other item on our bottom card, the password removal pads that we talked about earlier. We can get a little better view of them. They're right here below the memory SIM connector, right above the R87 indicator. All right, now we're down to the base cover. What comes with the base assembly are the memory door, the battery latches, this access door, and the modem insulator. Okay, what does not come with the base are the speaker and its gasket, the PCMCIA ground shield, as well as the hinge supports on the right and the left. These items can be reused from the old base should you be replacing the base. They're held in with double-sided sticky tape. The speaker itself has a field replaceable part number. Otherwise, there's also a modem connector door Any or all of this can be reused as needed. And that's the base assembly. Okay, now we can move on to the top, the LCD assembly. Okay, an important note on the top is the routing of the backlight and microphone cables. We'll get into that. In the hardware maintenance manual, it shows a specific detailed drawings on how they're routed. I'll show you as best as I can how it's done. It's a fairly simple top. The first thing we'll need to do is remove the screws for the keyboard opening cam. They're two 8mm screws. All of the screw sizes are also described very well in the maintenance manual. Their locations are pointed out. Having taken these apart several times, I've pretty much got it memorized, so I just use a generic screw box here. After removing the keyboard cam, remove the 4 screws for the LCD bezel. Right now the bezel has locking clips across the front and the side and the back. It also has double-sided adhesive tape across the front and the sides. So the first thing you're going to want to do is try to get the tape separated and release the locks in the front. This is a fairly flexible piece, so you can flex it a little bit. Try to work one corner up. And work the second corner up. And remove the latches and the springs with the bezel. Now these latches and springs are just they're held together by the top cover, so if you're not careful, they'll go flying. I'll go ahead and take one apart to show you. It's basically just spring held in place, and otherwise it just falls right out. So be careful, they will end up on the floor. We'll set that there for now. Okay, at this point, we're going to go ahead and want to remove the microphone and the microphone shield. It just simply lifts out. This protective sleeve is very important. This is part of what we'll be talking about later. But basically, as best as you can, go ahead and remove it. From this point, gently lift the LCD out. It's a self-contained unit. The connector, it's just a standard connector. And there it is, completely torn apart. All right, now we're ready to start our reassembly. A few notes. The T6 screws take a 2.5 inch-pound torque. The T1 screws are a 0.5 inch-pounds. Now the hardware maintenance manual has detailed sections on the internal microphone and sleeve, the LCD assembly, backlight cable routing, the top system board, and the memory DIMM. We're going to start with the top LCD assembly. Now this particular LCD is a TFT LCD, and remember the quickest way to check is the upper left-hand screw. If it's up in the corner, it's a TFT screen. If it's down about a half an inch, it's an STN screen. Now on the TFT screens, there are some 921,000 thin film transistors, and a small number of these transistors being bad is normal. There's a chart in the disassembling the LCD section in the hardware maintenance manual that describes this in detail. So now that we've decided that we've got a TFT screen. Let's go ahead and start by attaching the flat cable to the back. It's just a simple single snap. Okay. Now we're going to go ahead and set the LCD into the top cover. And now, this is important, is the microphone and backlight cable routing. It's important not to twist these wires. It's important to bring them out straight. This is our microphone sleeve that protects both sets of wires. First, we're going to want to insert it onto the microphone cable. Then we're going to want to insert the cable and the sleeve onto the backlight cable. With the brown wire first, and then the yellow wire. Okay, now what you want to end up with is the microphone cable on the bottom, the LCD cable on the top. Now, from this point, bring your sleeve up and your microphone in more or less together. Get your microphone into place while you're working your sleeve into the slot. Now what you should end up with is your microphone cable on the bottom, your LCD cable coming out of the LCD, turning right without twisting, and coming straight out. Okay, at this point, without really disturbing anything, let's go ahead and put the bezel on. Okay, let's make sure that your bezel has the latches in place with the springs, with the arrows pointing towards the outside of the system. Okay, to install the bezel, hook the front of the bezel into position. And as you draw it down, gently push it up. Make sure your cables are clear. Basically drop down. Make sure your 3 notches in the back are locked in. There's also another one under here. And install the 4 screws. Be careful, try not to scratch the bezel with your screwdriver. It's a little bit tight. Now before I tighten down any of these screws, I always make sure that the LCD is aligned. There's a little bit of play. If you need to, just slide it out. And now we're going to install the keyboard bezel. The keyboard cam. Okay, it just slides into place. It's held in. The 2 screws. 2 screws go through the left hinge into the keyboard cam. One thing I'd like to mention about the left hinge is that the left hinge is part of the top cover assembly. It does not come off, so if there's a bad left hinge, you're going to need to replace the entire top cover assembly. The entire top cover. The right hinge is replaceable by removing these 2 screws, and the hinge just pops out. Right now, finally, Wrap your LCD cable once around from behind, and for the time being, tape it into place out of the way. And that completes the top section. We're ready to go ahead and do the base. Let's go ahead with the installing of the bottom card. First, on the bottom card, let's go ahead and install the modem. Make sure the modem has the gasket positioned over this T1 transformer. It's mostly just to hold the modem in place until it's assembled. With the connectors, attach the connector. Okay, also, there again, if you're, as I mentioned before, if you're replacing the bottom board, reuse the PCMCIA slots, the rubber spacer, and also put a piece of insulator tape across the C107 capacitor. Now it's ready to be installed. Okay, to install it, let's clear our speaker wire out of the way for now. Sliding the back into the multi-port connector and into the right-hand hinge slot. Push the card towards the back of the unit. Now with the adhesive in place, sometimes it tries to stick, so just make sure it seats properly. And as it slides into place, the hard file connector will drop down into its slot, and make sure the modem connector pops out. Now that it's in, let's go ahead and run the fasteners for it. Here again, there's 3 screws holding the bottom in. It's recommended, to ensure that the alignment is proper, to put 1 screw in the back docking connector first. The second screw into the LCD cable area. And then the second screw into the docking connector. All right, at this point, you want to make sure that your 2 aluminum spacers are either in your bottom card or in your top card. In this particular case, we have 1 in each, as long as they're there. And if you do forget them, you can slip them into their position after the cards are together. It's just much easier this way. Okay, on the top board, now there is a procedure in the maintenance manual to describe it, but briefly, what you want to make sure is that your rubber spacers are in place, your standby battery is in place and taped in, and that the spring, the on-off spring switch, is in position with the spring in place. Now what you're going to want to do on the base is to make sure that your on-off slide switch is all the way towards the front of the unit, that your speaker wire is out of your way temporarily. Okay, we're going to go ahead and insert the inverter card onto the top board from this position. Now we're going to pivot the top card into place. What you're going to want to do is take the floppy parallel connector, slide it into position, engaging the top switch as you go, guiding the battery connector into place as you gently work it down, then guiding your inverter card into the 2 slots at the bottom of the base, At this point, you can install the infrared window. I normally choose to leave it until everything's seated. Okay, once you know your inverter is cleared of everything, gently push on the board-to-board connector area to seat the cards. Never push on this area without the modem being installed or without the modem filler plug. Trying to push here without that support is going to damage the cards. So once we've seated the cards properly, let's again make sure our inverter card is in its slots. You can go ahead and install the infrared window now with the notch out. I don't know if you can see that. With the notch out facing down, it just clips on to the IR window and then slides down into place. Okay, now make sure your two aluminum spacers are lined up. Pop those in. They're just kind of a pressed fit into place. Make sure your window isn't giving you a lot of trouble. And at this point, make sure your on-off switch works. Make sure it's engaged and it springs freely. Okay, at this point, we can go ahead and install the speaker wire so we don't forget for later. Okay, so our system's together. Got the base section. Now, we'll want to go ahead and attach the LCD assembly to the base section. What we're going to want to do is being careful not to tear up the cables. We're going to want to align the hinge to the guide pins. I don't know if you can see in here, there's a guide post on each side. The hinge is guided straight in. I'm going to have to do this sitting down so it aligns properly. Okay. Then we'll attach our hinge screws. All right. Let's open up the unit. Let's go ahead and install our ferrite core and install our LCD cable. At this point, again, make sure that your LCD cable is wrapped around from behind and it's coming out the bottom. If it's not, it can be worked in at this point, but you have to be real careful not to tear it or bend it. So let's install the ferrite. Now before installing this LCD cable, make sure your connectors are all the way wide open. Bring this around this way just a little bit. Using your guide stick. Trying to do this so you can see it here. And draw the cables back and slide them in. Now on these zero connectors, work them back and forth so you don't pinch the edge of the cables. Make sure they're seated completely and slide your ferrite core down. Okay. Now, the backlight connector and microphone wires. All right, so now we're coming out of the LCD assembly untwisted. What we're going to want to do, eventually the microphone is going to wrap down the inverter card into here. But for now, we need to get it out of our way. Just pull it out to the back. It seems to be the best. Go ahead and install the cable plug first into the back of the connector. Now, loop the microphone cable through to get it out of our way. Okay, let's go ahead and install the microphone plug and clean these wires up. Okay, the speaker and the microphone wires just tuck in between the inverter card and the PCMCIA slots. Try not to kink them, but basically they just lay in between. Okay, the microphone, when it's finished, should be laying across the inverter card at about this position. You don't want the microphone cables hanging out the side here because you can potentially view from the end. Okay, now the LCD backlight cable routing, which is detailed in the maintenance manual. Follow the procedure, but basically what it tells you to do is, without twisting the cables, run the two lines over top of the connector and tuck the loops down between the inverter card and the back of the machine without getting them inside the inverter card insulator, so that they basically end up laying on top of the connector and then looping down beside the LEDs. That should provide enough free clearance for opening and closing without putting any pressure, any binding on there. All right, at this point, we are ready to install the keyboard. The keyboard, again, we can't talk enough about this keyboard. It has the locking clips we talked about on the keyboard are positioned here, here, and here, and also one back here. Now they coincide with these locking clips here and also under these uprights. It's a little bit tricky, but it can be done. First thing we want to do is install the three connectors, doing the big keyboard connectors first. And finally the track point connector into position and lock it down. Okay. Now, guide the back of the keyboard into the openings. Gently pushing down and draw it forward. At this point, I always manually close the keyboard and check to make sure that I've engaged the locking clips here. And here. This all looks flat, so I know I'm good. Okay, at this point, first thing you're going to want to do is install this back right-hand keyboard screw. It's a 5mm short T6 screw. For me, I use a pair of tweezers. Get it into the hole. See if I can show that a little better. And start off by just tightening it a little bit. It's just to help hold the keyboard in place. Now the important thing is not to put too much pressure on these 4 screws in the front. These are T1 screws at 0.5 inch-pounds, and I'm going to use my hand driver because it's easier to control. Okay, I start with the 2 center screws. Sometimes you have to adjust the keyboard left or right just a little bit to align it. Here again, I don't tighten these screws until I've got all of them into place. And I always finish with the screw on the right. Because the screw on the right is the most vulnerable. Go ahead and remember to go back, tighten them up. Say fingertip tight is all these are. Yes, you can strip them. Yes, you can break them. Remember that. All right. Now also, remembering to go back and tighten up this screw in the back. Okay. Now, before we install the remaining 5 screws for the keyboard, let's go ahead and install the keyboard cover, and we'll take care of all that in the bottom. Okay, the keyboard cover has 4 locking clips as well as the 2 screws that we took off. These 4 locking clips lock into the base in the back as well as onto the keyboard behind the cam closure. Okay, with the unit all the way open and making sure that your backlight cable routing is correct. There's not much clearance. We gently insert it, kind of leaning towards the back to clear the IR window. Gently snapping it into place. Okay, now at this point you're going to have to be careful because you're going to need to close the top to get to the screws on the bottom. But if the keyboard cover is not seated, it's going to catch on the LCD. Be careful or you'll rip this end off. I always kind of hold it, bring it in together. Let's go ahead and flip it over. Okay, the screw pattern, like I say again, it's spelled out in the maintenance manual. I happen to know that for this, the 16mm screw starts there. The 10mm screw is in the middle. The 8mm screw is on the end. And that the 3 remaining screws are 6mm screws. They're the same size. So we'll go ahead and slide these in. Okay, let's go ahead and tighten all this up. The screw for the keyboard cover on the right side. Okay, at this point we're into the final assembly, reinstalling the memory DIMM. The DIMM is notched to fit only one way. Slides in at about a 30-degree angle, and then gently push down to lock it into place. Placing the door just snaps in. Okay, finally, let's go ahead and install the rest of our devices. In this case, hard file first. Just gently slides in. Battery. Being careful, don't just slap the battery in. Try to gently set it in and make sure it seats. The PCMCIA cover. It is also interlocked to the hard file. It just pivots into place, snaps in. And also the floppy drive cover. This is just a rubber cover. Has an interlocking mechanism. Mainly, we just kind of squeeze it into the position. Then lock it down. And then what we want to do is power it on, verify that the keyboard cam mechanism is working. Want to go ahead and power it on, verify operation, and then remember to reset the customer configuration. And that concludes the teardown and rebuild of the 2630. Now one other note, to clean the LCD, we use a mixture of rubbing alcohol and water, a 50-50 solution. It seems to do best on the LCD. It also works well on the cover. Just rub it in a horizontal motion and then dry it off afterwards using a soft cloth. Please don't use any paper type products on the LCD. It will scratch them. And that concludes the reassembly of the 701s.
Thanks, Ken, for the overview on the exciting new ThinkPad 701. The ThinkPad 760 contains many new and unique features. Some of these features include an enhanced video card that supports MPEG-2 full-screen video, stereo speakers, a MIDI joystick port, and a quad-speed CD-ROM. Rick Cipher from our Mobile Products Engineering team is now in the service area and ready to tell us more about the ThinkPad 760.
The ThinkPad 760 family supports the features of the 755 and includes many new features. These new features include a Pentium 90 MHz microprocessor, 8 to 40 megabytes of memory using DIMMs, a 720 megabyte or a 1.2 gigabyte hard file, a redesigned keyboard, a 12.1-inch TFT display, and hardware MPEG video decompression. Now let's take a look at some of these new features. This is the 760 CD model. Let's take a look at it. When we open the LCD, there's two things that are obviously different over the 755 family, one being a larger display, the other being the redesigned keyboard. This display on the 760 CD is a 12.1-inch TFT SVGA active matrix display. The 12.1 inches is measured diagonally. This is standard on the 760 CD model, and there are two models of the 760C, one that has this display and one that has a 10.4 TFT display. On the LCD panel, in the upper right-hand corner is where the microphone, the built-in microphone is, and also the brightness control for the LCD panel. Now, taking a look at the keyboard, I'm not sure if you noticed it whenever I lifted up the display, but the keyboard tilts up at a more convenient typing angle if you so desire. This can be dropped to a horizontal position by pressing either one of the two keyboard lift levers on each side of the keyboard. Some other features of this redesigned keyboard are the LCD status display. This shows battery life and also activity of your hard file and floppy drive. To the right of it is this slide control is the volume control on this system. The position of the whole keyboard has been moved back. This has enabled the addition of a palm rest in the front of the keyboard. Built into the palm rest on each side are stereo speakers. The keyboard incorporates a TrackPoint 3 pointing device. The mouse buttons are located here and still support the sticky function. And one other display that's a little different are these LEDs right here. This one indicating that the battery is active, and the green light indicates that it's in a charged state. The next LED position indicates when the system is in suspend mode, and the third LED on the back indicates when the system is powered on. Now I'm going to power down this system now. And let's take a look at some of the changes around the outside of the system. On the front of this system, on the right-hand side, is where the front IR lens is. There's two infrared lenses on this system, one in the front and one in the back. This is the CD-ROM. On the left side of the system is the LCD release switch. This area here is still, we still have an access door for options that go in the floppy drive bay that may need it. This door has been removed. On the 760 CD version, we have the video in and video out ports. Below that is the modem connector, power on-off switch, and below that is the stereo headphone jack and the microphone input jack. On the rear of the system is the port area. There's normally a port cover door here that's hinged on the bottom, which has been removed on this system. And starting on this end is where the AC adapter plugs in. This is the serial port, the parallel port, the external monitor port. This is the rear IR lens. This 240-pin jack here is for docking stations. You can still use a dock 1 or a dock 2 or either port replicator from this that was announced with the 755 series. And on the 760 CD version, we have an external floppy drive port for using an external floppy drive while you still have the CD-ROM installed. And there's a MIDI joystick port. I don't know if you can see this or not, but when we get into FRU removals and replacements, I'm going to show you how to be careful and not let this happen to your system with a little bit of cracked plastic there. Moving around to the other side of the system, this is the external keyboard and mouse port, the PCMCIA access doors to the PCMCIA socket, and it's still two Type 2 or one Type 3 PCMCIA sockets. The doors have been changed so they're integrated into the bottom case. They're spring-loaded and hinged. The PCMCIA buttons here will pop out whenever you insert a card and will fold over to lock the card in place. This is for Kensington lock. And you'll see another small icon here. This is for locking the DIMM memory compartment so that if you have additional memory in your system, you can't remove that door if you have it in the locked position. And this is the other LCD release. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is flip the system over and we'll take a look at the DIMM area for adding memory. This is where you access the DIMM area, and as I said, you can lock this, and right now it's in the locked position so it won't open. So let me unlock it. Remove the DIMM access door. This reveals the DIMM adapter card, which unplugs. This system uses unique DIMMs, which are available in 8 megabyte or 16 megabytes. When in combination with the 8 megs that comes standard with the system, you can have up to 40 megabytes of system memory. And I'll put this back together. Okay. Now let's take a look underneath the keyboard. The first thing that you want to remember whenever you open this keyboard is I recommend opening the LCD panel the whole way because it balances a little bit different and the keyboard will remain open if you have this open the whole way. Drop the keyboard to a horizontal position, and on this system we press back on the release switches instead of pulling forward like we did on the 755s. That will allow you to open the keyboard. When we open the keyboard, we see the CD-ROM, the main lithium-ion battery, and the hard drive. In this case, this is the 1.2 gigabyte hard drive. I'm going to remove those. One thing that's changed quite a bit in this system is in this area, the floppy bay, or what we're calling the Ultra Bay. This Ultra Bay has been enhanced to incorporate new options. You can put a second hard drive in this bay, which in combination on this system with the 1.2 gig hard drive that's in here, you can have a total of 2.4 gigabytes of storage. There's also an optional PCMCIA Type 3 socket that can be placed in this area. Of course, the CD-ROM and your floppy drive. There's an optional 2.88 megabyte floppy drive as well. But maybe what's changed the most on this system is the ability to add a second lithium-ion battery to this bay. The optional second battery would be the same as the main battery, and then to install it, you need to remove the spacer that's located in the front of the bay. To remove it, you simply squeeze these two tabs and lift it out. Turn it around, place it over the Ultra Bay connector. Flip up the blue plastic cover, and this will reveal the second set of battery terminals. And at that point, you can take your lithium-ion battery and install it in the Ultra Bay. In case you would ever want to do so, the system will boot and operate with the battery in this position. The maintenance package and diagnostics are the same as the 755 family. Now we're ready for FRU removal and replacements. Okay, now we're ready to do the disassembly of this 760 CD. I've already removed the CD-ROM, the battery, and the hard drive on this system. And just as a reminder, while those are user removable, if we're going to get underneath the other covers, we want to wear ESD protection. The major steps in doing the disassembly of this system will be to remove the keyboard, remove the LCD assembly, then remove the logic assembly underneath, and then there will be two sub-assemblies. We are going to disassemble the keyboard, and we're going to disassemble the logic can assembly. The keyboard, if you remember on previous systems, was a FRU by itself. This keyboard has some disassembly and some individual FRUs inside of it. So, the very first thing that I'm going to do is remove the top covers, which are held in place by 5 screws. On the systems that you get, these screws will be covered with adhesive covers in these positions here. There's also 2 adhesive covers on the back in these positions, which also have been removed on this system. Let me point out that there's 40 plus screws that you'll be removing during this disassembly, and I recommend some type of management to keep the screws in order so that you don't get mixed up on which screws go where. I have just made up a simple template where I'm going to lay the screws on here to keep them in order. If another popular way would be just to leave the screws and the hardware near the assembly that you remove. Now that the screws have been removed on the top cover, we can lift off the top cover. Be careful of the suspend resume switch, which is located just above the LCD status display. There's a cutout in the top cover that you don't want to catch, and that lifts off. The next thing we want to remove is the keyboard itself. The keyboard has been released by removing the top cover, and we want to stand it up and carefully unplug it. Okay, the keyboard's now removed. We'll set this aside for now, and we will disassemble this a little bit later. Okay, now that the keyboard has been removed, the next thing we'll do is remove the LCD assembly. The LCD assembly is held in place by 2 screws in the front and 6 screws in the back. With the screws removed, the LCD can be lifted off. I want to point out the LCD assembly is very vulnerable at this point. The area in the center where the LEDs are it can be torqued if you lift up the LCD and you're not careful. And in fact, that's how this piece got damaged on this system. So please be careful and use caution. And don't force anything. The LCD assembly lifts out, unplugs here, and we also need to unplug the microphone cable. And there you have the LCD assembly. With the keyboard and the LCD assembly removed, the next disassembly will be to go into the logic assembly can, which is located here. The next thing that we're going to remove is the front and the rear IR sensors. On this system, the front IR area has a shield which has been removed on this system. On the systems you see, there will be a shield in this area underneath the hard drive. The front IR is removed by removing 3 screws, two by the hard drive connector and one in the front by the IR unit itself. The front IR is now free with the exception of the cable, which can be pulled straight out from its connector. Now to remove the rear IR, there's one screw securing it. After removing this screw, the rear IR will unplug. The next part of the disassembly would be to remove the logic can assembly from the system. Now this will be required if you need to replace any of the cards that are inside the system. The first steps to removing the logic assembly can will be to remove the modem cover, the on-off switch, and then the PCMCIA eject buttons. To remove the modem cover, there's a metal latch on the inside that slides upward. Like so. Once it's removed, the door covering the modem can be removed. Once the modem cover is removed, the modem can be removed by pressing the slide switch to the left to eject it. And next will be the on-off switch. The on-off actuator is held in place by a catch right behind it on the inside, which needs to be raised slightly. When it's raised, the on-off actuator can be removed. A little hint here, if you pull too hard on this, it will actually hold the on-off actuator in. You have to pull it up as far as it'll go and then ease it back a little bit, and that'll release the on-off switch. So if you have trouble pulling that out, push this back in just a little bit. Once you've done it once, you'll start to develop a feel for it, but it's that first time that you'll notice that. Once the on-off actuator has been removed, the catch will now slide out. The next thing that must be done is to remove the PCMCIA eject buttons. I'm going to lay the system flat to do this. We'll pull the top button out. You need to use something small enough to get in here to release it, like a toothpick, or I'm using a paper clip. And we'll press straight down lightly on the metal tab and pull the eject button out. This is where the clip needs to be depressed to remove it. After the PCMCIA buttons have been removed, we're about ready to take out the logic can assembly. Before we do it, let's take out the DIMM adapter card. By removing the door. in popping out the card. Now we're ready to remove the logic assembly by removing these 3 screws in the back and these 2 screws by the ultra bay. These 2 screws, these 2 screws, and these 4. After removing the screws on the back of the keyboard, we can now remove the palm rest. Like so. The next thing we want to remove are the keyboard lift levers. They're removed by using a screwdriver and sliding them off by pressing in through the hole and pulling it off. The next thing we want to do is remove the 2 circuit board screws here. At this time, you can see underneath the palm rest that the standby and backup batteries are in fact in the keyboard now, as opposed to the 755 series. The next part of the disassembly is going to be to remove the LCD status display. Okay. Okay. To get to the display, we have to loosen the front assembly. Be careful with this because there's ribbon cables connected underneath the circuit card. The ribbon cable on my left is simply plugged in. The other 4 here have to be released. Okay, now we can get to the LCD assembly. On the back of the keyboard is an additional screw that has to be removed. And once that's removed, we remove the cover by gently prying it on the right-hand side. And the status LCD assembly will now slide out of the keyboard. If you need to further disassemble this to replace either the batteries or the speakers, the speakers are removed by unplugging, as are the batteries by pulling straight out. And that would complete the disassembly of the keyboard. Next, we're ready to take apart the logic assembly. To do this, we're going to take out 4 Phillips screws, 2 from the front by the main battery terminals, and 2 from on top through the top can. At this time, we can take off the top shield. And what we see when we take that shield off is the video card. The video card will look slightly different on the 760C model. We'll remove the floppy drive cable. And the speaker cable over on the left, which simply pulls out. And remove 2 Phillips screws located here and here. Once the 2 screws holding the video card have been removed, we need to remove the MIDI joystick port. Easy for me to say. And of course, this port doesn't exist on the 760C model. We can start to remove the video card by gently rocking it out. It's plugged in with a connector in the center. You need to be careful with it because there are still some cables attached to it from the underside. Once you have it loose, you can rock it forward a little bit and pull out the video in and out cable. And the video card has now been removed. At this time, if you needed to remove the floppy drive connector, you could do so by removing 2 Phillips head screws. I'm not going to do that right now, but I am going to get ready to remove the DC-DC card and the DSP card. The first thing I'm going to do is remove the DAA housing by removing a Phillips screw on the left-hand side. Which releases it. Unplug the DC-DC card. It's only held in by the connector. Remove a second Phillips screw, and I'll be able to remove the DSP card. Okay. Now we're down to the planar or system board. Now to remove the system board, we have to remove 2 Phillips screws in the PCMCIA socket, which are located on the right. We're going to remove the port studs here. The 2 studs in between the external display and the parallel port do not have to be removed. And then we'll remove 4 flathead screws securing the CPU card. To remove the port studs, you're going to need a 5mm and a 5.5mm nut driver. And the 4 screws on the bottom side. The bottom of the assembly can be removed. And what you see when you turn the system board over is the CPU card. The CPU card can be released from the system board. By unplugging it on my left-hand side. And what we have is the CPU card, the heat sink for the microprocessor chip, and on the bottom of the logic assembly, as we did before, this is still the same. We have a heat sink which is attached to it. If you needed to remove the PCMCIA socket, you could do so at this time by removing 2 Phillips screws here, the external mouse screw, and removing the socket. So that completes the disassembly of the logic. Okay, now that we've got the system apart, we're ready to put it back together. The assembly of the 760 CD is roughly the opposite of taking it apart, with a couple minor changes. We're going to start with putting back together the logic assembly, then we're going to put together the keyboard, and then once we get those 2 sub-assemblies put back together, we'll put the rest of the system unit together. We're going to start with the logic assembly. If we take the system board and set it here in front of us, the first thing that we're going to do is reattach the CPU card. It's important to point out the way we took this apart was we left the CPU card come off the system board when we removed the bottom of the can itself, the shield. But it's important that when you put the CPU card back onto the system board, that the connector between the CPU card and the system board is engaged fully. We're going to do that by placing the heat sink on the system board and matching the connectors on the CPU card to the system board. And pressing the connectors together, like so. It's very important that you do not apply pressure to the area right underneath the CPU itself, because you can damage that. Okay. Once that is plugged in securely, then we can put on the bottom shield of the logic assembly. And we'll attach it with the 4 flathead screws that screw into the heat sink. After the 4 flathead screws have been in place, then we can put back the 2 screws at the PCMCIA area. After replacing those 2 screws, we can replace the studs in the port area on the back of the system board. At this point, the CPU card has been reinstalled to the system board and the bottom of the logic assembly shield has been installed. The next thing we're going to do is install the DSP card. We'll do this by taking the DSP card and repositioning it over the system board. This speaker cable on the left can fit through the little window or hole in the back of the can near the ports, and work it down into position and seat the connector by pressing on it. Now at this point we can put the modem housing back on. We'll sit it in place, reattach the screw holding it, and we can reattach the other screw to secure the DSP card. Okay, the DSP card has now been reinstalled. Next we'll install the DC-DC card. I like to keep the microphone cable out at this point, hanging over the back edge. To reinstall this, we simply plug it in. Okay, the DC-DC card has been installed. Just as a reminder, if you had taken out the floppy drive connector, this would be a good time to put that back in. I didn't actually pull it out. The next thing that we're going to do is reinstall the video card. The first thing that we want to do with the video card is move it into position, reattach the video in and out ribbon connector to the bottom of the video card. Which is a little tricky anyway, and then trying to do it so that you can view it just makes it a little trickier. Okay, it presses in place. Then we position the video card. And I like to make sure that I'm not pinching this microphone wire here. Once it's all in position, we can reseat the connector. Okay. We can reinsert the floppy drive ribbon cable. And closing the connector. I'll replug the speaker cable, which passes through, again, the same opening that we pulled it through earlier. Next, we can replace the MIDI joystick screws. Okay. And the last step to assembling the video card is to put the two screws back that secure it. Okay, the video card has been replaced. The next step will be to replace the top of the logic assembly by placing the shield. Okay. We can replace now the screws around the battery area. There's 4 screws here, 2 flat heads and 2 Philister heads. Okay, and that does it for the logic unit. It's important to note that you don't have to memorize these steps as I've performed them here, because they are well documented in the hardware maintenance manual. I'm going to set this subassembly aside for now, and the next thing that we'll put together again is the keyboard unit. We're ready to reinstall the keyboard now. Before I start the first step, I wanted to make sure that I didn't forget to point out something to you. If we have a close-up view, what I've got is the logic card that goes into the keyboard with the speaker and battery assemblies. And if you pay attention to this right here, you can see the result of a pinched wire. I'll try and point it out whenever I do this part of the assembly, but I wanted to make sure to point it out now to keep these wires away from where the screw will go in to prevent this pinching from occurring. I wanted to make sure that you had a chance to see that. Okay, to start the actual assembly of the keyboard, I'm going to replace the LCD status display. Insert the ribbon cable through the keyboard slot. And reposition the LCD display like so. And I'll reattach the cover. A little suggestion is that you be sure that you have the position of the volume pot in the same position that you have the volume actuator to make sure that it engages correctly. And I'm going to try and do this so that I'm not hovering over it so you can't see. There we go. No, I don't think that I have it. Okay, now the actuator is controlling the potentiometer itself. Now on the bottom side of the keyboard, I can replace the screw holding the LCD status cover. Okay. Next, I'll take the base of the keyboard unit. Make sure that if you've removed or replaced this keyboard cable here, that the connector on this side actually sits underneath the retainers so that it's down flat. Lay it in position, and now we're ready to replace the speakers and the batteries. Oops. I had it rotated 180 degrees. The backup battery is on the left, and the standby battery is on the right. On the 755s, this used to be in the floppy drive bay. Okay, again, without trying to block your view, I'm going to reattach the ribbon cables, flip this assembly over, and when I do so, I'll reseat this connector here. This part of the ribbon cable will actually go over top of the assembly. One more time, I'll make sure these wires are away from this mounting hole. To prevent the speaker or battery wire from being pinched. Okay, getting everything back into position. What I'm doing right now is making sure that I get the speaker. There's a tab on the right-hand speaker that goes underneath a tab on the keyboard base. If you don't get that tab on the right-hand speaker underneath that, it will not seat well enough to allow this assembly to go back together. Okay, now it looks like we're ready to reinstall the two screws holding the logic card. Okay, with that reattached, now I can reinstall the keyboard lift levers. By the way, there is a left and a right. The keyboard lever should have the little post sticking out from the keyboard when it's installed. Again, this is pictured pretty well in the hardware maintenance manual. Place it through the keyboard. And over this slide for the hinge. That's one. And two. And you should hear them snap into place. So now our keyboard raising mechanism is back in place. Now we're ready to reinstall the palm rest. The palm rest should first snap into position. Like so. And you can tell that it's seated correctly by just lining it up along the bottom to make sure that all the snaps have seated. Once you're comfortable that that's been done, turn it over, and now we can reinstall the screws on the base. With the installation of those screws, the keyboard assembly has now been reassembled. Now that the keyboard's been reassembled and the logic assembly's been reassembled, we're ready to put it all back together. The major steps left to replace the units is to put the logic assembly back in the base, reinstall the keyboard and LCD assembly. The first thing that I'm going to do is reinstall the logic assembly. I've got the base of the system unit, and we'll take the logic assembly that we just rebuilt and reposition it. And set it in place. It goes in place pretty nicely if you set the back corners in and just sort of slide it back. Note the position of the microphone cable here. It would be good to have it come out through this opening rather than out at this point by the rear IR lens. Once that's in place, I can replace the screws to secure it to the bottom. I'll replace the 2 screws near the ultra bay socket. And the 3 screws at the top of the logic assembly. And I'll just seat these. The 4th screw, if you remember, gets installed because it also mounts the rear IR. Okay, with the logic assembly secured, we can now reinstall the PCMCIA buttons. Although the PCMCI buttons just simply press into place, I think it's worth pointing out to you that you actually take the time to make sure that it's properly oriented for a couple reasons. One is obviously it won't work correctly if it's not, and second, since the tab assembly is a fragile piece of hardware, you don't want to damage it when you insert it. The easiest way that I found to do this would be to pull on it slightly and bend it to the locked position. This way you can be sure that the locked position matches up with the side of the case and you are in fact putting it in the correct way. I'll start by installing the bottom one. It presses into place. Ensure that the top one is oriented correctly. And press it on. Okay. Now that the PCMCIA buttons have been replaced, we can start to replace the modem and the on-off actuator. I'll start by replacing the on-off actuator. This piece captures the on-off actuator, if you remember, as we took it apart. And I'll start by sliding it into position. What you want to do is not press it all the way into position. Leave it unseated slightly. And as you look into the side, you'll see the slot in the opening that will allow the on-off button to be inserted. This is very obvious when you look inside. When it's lined up, the on-off actuator should go into position. And ensure that it does actually engage the on-off switch. Once you've done that, now you can seat the plate so it captures the on-off switch in position. Next, I'll reinstall the modem. Connector. It slides into place and you'll feel the connector seat. Then I'll take the cover, I'll place it in position on the outside of the case and capture it with the clip. It presses into place, and I'll slide the clip into place like so to capture it. Okay, with those pieces reinstalled, I can reinstall the front and the rear IR. Make sure that your rear IR lens is installed. Probably should have pointed this out at the same time that we started the logic assembly installation. If you've already locked in the logic assembly but you're missing your rear IR lens, it'll be very difficult at this point to get it in. Fortunately, it's not too bad to get that released if you do have to reinsert it. I'll start with the rear IR assembly. Seat it in its connector. Reattach the mounting screw. For the front IR, the ribbon cable goes through the plastic on the bottom cover, and I'm going to have to flip the base up so that I reseat the ribbon connector. The ribbon connector simply presses into the socket. And once it's seated, I can secure it. As I pointed out during the disassembly, there will be a shield in this position here that will go on at this point also, which is not on this system. The two front screws by the hard drive socket secure the top of the logic assembly can, and also will secure the shield underneath the hard drive. Okay, with these parts in place, we can reinstall the keyboard. I recommend that you start with the keyboard vertical, seat the connector, and then set it into place. With the keyboard in position, the next step is to reattach the LCD assembly. Okay, now I'm ready to replace the LCD. Carefully position the LCD assembly, and if you notice, I have it positioned so that it will slide into place in the fully open position. as I set it into position, let the microphone cable that comes out of the logic assembly go through the hole in the LCD assembly. And set it into place. There we go. I'm going to seat the LCD ribbon cable. And I'm going to secure the LCD assembly with 2 screws near the top of the keyboard. I'll reattach the microphone cable. Like so, and just press it so it sits flat. I'd like to point out to you that I may have mentioned earlier that there's a piece of plastic cracked on this unit. This center portion of the LCD assembly is in a very vulnerable position at this point. You can get a lot of leverage working against it by simply flipping open and close the LCD assembly, because this portion where the LEDs are for the power indicator suspend is not secured. So I point this out so that you keep it positioned correctly and then carefully close the LCD assembly. With the LCD assembly closed, I can reconnect the 6 screws in the port area on the rear of the system. Making sure that I'm seated correctly and all my screw holes will line up. I'll get them started before I drive them home, just to make sure that they will all start. Please be careful of the center 2 Phillips screws, which are flatheads. They're very tiny, and if you cross thread one with a large screwdriver, you might not even feel it. So just take a little time and be careful that it is going in okay. Those felt okay going in. As I pointed out, if you hadn't already done so, you could replace the port door. Now our LCD assembly is attached. The next step is to replace the top cover. Again, be careful when you replace this that you don't damage the suspend resume switch, which I pointed out earlier. With the top cover in position, we can replace the remaining screws. Keep track of the screws because they are not all the same. Okay, after replacing these screws, the adhesive screw covers can be replaced on the top cover and, as I pointed out earlier, over the two flathead screws in the center. I'll replace the DIMM adapter card and the DIMM cover. Okay. I'll replace the user installable options, the hard drive, battery, and CD-ROM. And the reassembly is complete. I hope this segment will help you service the ThinkPad 760.
Thanks, Rick, for the insight into the ThinkPad 760. If you have technical questions concerning the topics covered in this video, please call your IBM Support Center for assistance. This video was designed to complement the ThinkPad Models Service Training Series course and highlights new product information that was not available when the original course was created. We hope the topics presented were of value to you, and thanks for sharing your time with us.